I'm home.
Throws to the near side, and that's intercepted. Intercepted by Jack Jones, heading down the near sideline, and this will be a pick six for Jack Jones and a touchdown for Arizona State.
People here, when you think of Sun Devil football, you think of Sun Devil for life.
Here we go, 7 seconds. Berkovici. He's just going to air it out deep downfield, and no white shirts around. Oh, Jalen Strong! Caught for a touchdown! Jalen Strong makes the catch!
I went to Arizona State. Right. I'm a Sun Devil, man.
This is about the Valley. We need the Valley. If we get the Valley all in, the sky is the limit.
Welcome to Speak of the Devils, the premier podcast for Sun Devil football. I'm Brad Denny with 3TV.
I'm Joe Healy with DevilsDigest.com.
Joe, it is time to roll out the maroon carpet. It is one of the most anticipated episodes of the year. Now, of course, it's coming a little bit later than usual, in part because of the new coaching staff, the whirlwind of portal activity. But finally, it is time for the Speak of the Devils Season Awards Spectacular.
Christmas is come and gone, but there are some gifts to give, and even some that might be a little bit dubious in nature. So, there's some generosity left to dole out here as we give out our awards. Obviously, in a season like ASU had at 3-9, and you change coaching staffs, there might be some things that more lean toward frustration and regret and contempt than massive jubilation, but there's some good and some bad to discuss. We, kind of take things kind of evenly and go through some of the best, some of the worst, and otherwise that happened over the course of this season. So, there were some performances and accomplishments that are certainly worth recognizing, and that's exactly what we'll do.
All right, so we will dive into all those categories, honoring the best and worst of the season that was for the 2022 Sun Devils. But of course, there is no offseason in college football anymore, so there's obviously a lot of news and moves to catch you up on. Starting off with some of the news items here. A familiar face. This is just the trend, the way it is. If you play for the Sun Devils, chances are the door is open for you to come back. And this is a good one because this is a guy who was a kind of an unsung contributor for ASU on the offensive line for a while. Former offensive lineman Stephen Miller is coming back in a graduate assistant capacity. Most recently had some time over at SMU, who's been doing some good things out there.
Yeah, local guy from the high school level, multi-year starter here. So you love to see guys come back home, and he's got some experience under his belt doing what he's doing now, working into the coaching gig. So you love to see that sort of thing coming back because, no matter what level it is, whether it's the head coach, assistant coaches, GAs, any sort of admin or support staff, if you've got folks that are alums, if they've been through these walls and on that field, if they don the maroon and gold, no matter what they're doing, if they're back on this staff, you figure they're going to bring a different level of passion than others might. So, again, a great ad. Love to see that. Really have a ton of respect for Steve as a person and an athlete. So, again, happy to see him back here in Tempe.
Yeah, every interaction I've ever had with him has been great. So, in hearing great things about his upward trajectory in the business, so I'm sure he'll do great things here on Kenny Dillingham's staff. No, it's not great things. I think, as we were recording last week's episode, we were commenting on ASU basketball's complete annihilation at the hands of the University of San Francisco. At the time, ASU was finally back in the polls after a little bit of an absence at number 25. Well, after that massive loss, they are out of the not just out of the poll, Joe. They didn't receive a single AP vote a week after not just being ranked, but I believe the highest rank or highest vote that they had was for number 10 in the country.
Man, like a lead balloon. But it would be the most ASU thing, almost to the point of like being able to script it. That they go out there on New Year's Eve afternoon and go beat the Wildcats, something like that. And I would take that exchange if that happens to be the case. We'll see what happens, but Yeah, we were talking about it because we were literally watching that ball game here as we were recording last week. That was just a really ugly sight. I know Bobby Hurley talking about how they were like not even going to address it, just going to flush it and move on. I think those were paraphrasing his words, but I think flush it was the term that was used. So you hope that can happen because you don't want to excuse that sort of performance and let it affect you moving forward because my goodness, ASU has shown so much potential. Of course, they've still got some momentum in terms of their conference record, having already played some games. So, as disheartening as it was, and as much as ASU fans kind of like to jump the gun a little bit and, get excited in positive and negative ways when things may not be deserving of such extreme reactions, we'll see what happens because, again, this Saturday afternoon, New Year's Eve day, they'll be playing the Wildcats here in Tempe, which, of course, is a top 10 team. So we'll see if they can get back in the win column in a way that would really cheer folks up entering the new year.
ASU does conclude non-conference play at 11-2, which I think if you asked any Sun Devil fan or supporter out there before the season tipped off, if they take that, absolutely. You would take an 11-2 mark. And now, granted, I don't think the 2 came against perhaps some of the teams that you maybe would have thought. ASU, of course, has some nice wins along that stretch, including that big win over then at number 20 ranked Michigan. But as you said, perhaps a loss like this might shake them back up and get them back after even though the loss did end the Kyle Dad victory stash streak. Maybe this will help get them refocused for that New Year's Eve showdown with Arizona. Now moving on to the portal. Now, as our weekly reminder, this, of course, is open for 45 days. This portal window closes on January 18th. Since we last talked to you, only one Sun Devil in the portal has found a destination. That is Ben Scott. He is now headed to Nebraska. He joins a couple of the other committed Sun Devils that are in there. Paul Tyson to Clemson, defensive end Joe Moore to Washington, offensive lineman Ladarius Henderson to Michigan, running back Daniel Ngata to Washington, long snapper Gage King to UCF, long snapper John Furlman to Ohio State, punter Eddie Chaplitsky to USC, and quarterback Emory Jones to Cincinnati.
Yeah, so that was a move that wasn't too unexpected. I know there was some talk or wonder if Scott might return, but just about as quickly as that departure was solidified, ASU went and found his replacement. So if there was any crying over spilled milk at that time, I tell you, it was minimal. Yeah,
and since we our last episode, there's only one other Sun Devil that has jumped into the portal that is also on the offensive line, Armand Bethea, reserve that has been around the program for the last couple of years. Probably the most notably played a little bit of defensive line against Wisconsin in the Vegas Bowl last December, kind of out of necessity. ASU was so depleted, but he now becomes the 18th Sun Devil in the portal, along with the ones that we mentioned that have found new homes. The Markham brothers are still in there. Defensive tackle Omar Norman Lott, kicker Jace Feely, wide receiver Cam Johnson, cornerback Isaiah Johnson, defensive end Garen Stansbury, and quarterback Finn Collins. But Joe, you mentioned that ASU was not feeling the void at center for very long because they got themselves not just a quality addition, but a guy who has a pretty extensive resume and really experienced. That's center Leif Fatano from UNLV, 6'2", 305-pounder, 28 career starts on the resume. Guy who was on the Remington Award watch list. And again, which is pretty nice in this the age of the transfer portal, you're not just getting a guy who has a lot of experience, but has multiple years left. In Fatano's case, he has 2 years left of eligibility.
Yeah, so I think that at worst, it's basically an even trade. Ben Scott's got 2 years. He's got 2 years. Guys that kind of have similar backgrounds in terms of maybe starting experience, accolades, that sort of thing. So, we'll see how it pans out. But that's a name that, when he was added to the transfer portal from UNLV and when ASU had the entries it did, that was one that just kind of made sense, was on the radar a little bit, wasn't sure if it was going to pan out, but that came together, in a hurry there last week. And again, like I said, it's someone that you feel very comfortable with at this point. On paper gives you a veteran presence, and don't look, but it looks like ASU might have a semblance of an offensive line you might be able to roll with heading into next year. Now, obviously, I'm sure they're going to continue to do some work along those lines, and obviously, you never know what happens in the transfer portal as far as exits are concerned. But there could be a feasible offensive line starting 5 based solely on the players that you have right here, right now on the roster between the returners and the established incoming transfers and signees.
Yeah, so we'll talk about the offensive line here in a second with another addition. But kind of moving in order where ASU was kind of active, and after that initial wave of the signing day announcements and the official made the commitments and transfer portal additions that were made official, Kenny Dillingham made mention that any additions from here on out will be made for guys who can make an immediate impact. And so the 3 guys that we're talking about, Fatano being the first. The second was wide receiver Xavier Guillory from Idaho State. Of course, last year coming over and playing for Charlie Regal, now ASU's assistant head coach and special teams coordinator. He was Idaho State's head coach a year ago. Guillory was a guy who was very productive last year, 52 catches, 785 yards. A guy who's a lot of kind of named schools were after him as well. 6'2", 205-pounder, and just another outside weapon for the Sun Devil passing game.
Yeah, a lot of talk right now is that he could be a legitimate candidate to start, along with Elijah Badger, Gio Sanders. As you mentioned, when you have players like this who jump up from the FCS level, an early gauge on what they can bring to the table is going to be who are the competitors for the services. And, the ones that at least seem to be in the mix for Guillory, Washington State, Utah, Oklahoma. If you're going head-to-head with some of those schools, then you got to feel pretty good about the addition that you make. Of course, there's a comfort level with Charlie Regal, maybe to a lesser extent Vince Amy. So that was someone, again, you see some of these entries when they get into the transfer portal, and it just makes sense. Hey, a productive wide receiver who you feel like is going to make the leap to the FBS level and likely the Power 5 level. ASU has, the head coach. As long as that was a good relationship, it makes sense for that sort of transfer to happen. So this is one that, again, just the math seemed to add up from day one. There was some stiff competition for his services, and in the end, ASU won out.
And then a notable local commitment, and a lot has been made, and rightfully so, about the Herm Edwards era and the relative lack of success, perhaps lack of effort, of ASU trying to maintain and keep the local top prospects in Arizona. This is one that is coming back because he was number 2 in the state in the class of 2021. Offensive tackle Bram Walden, 6'5", 305-pounder, coming over from Oregon along with Kenny Dillingham. He was the number 111 overall player in the class a year ago. He saw real brief duty in 2 games last year, but so he has all 4 years of eligibility left. And this is just as another big, talented piece for the Sun Devil offensive line that I think, as we'll talk about it here in a second, I think is overall with these additions have a great mix of young, high upside developmental type players and also guys that can come in and play right away.
Again, one that just made sense when he entered the transfer portal. He went to Saguaro, so you got Jason Mons. Played at Oregon, you got Kenny Dillingham, so it just made a heck of a lot of sense. He had some high-level teams after him, but it was one that a lot of people were saying was an inevitability. And in all actuality, a lot of folks are wondering, it's like, okay, is the old Ted Knight gift from Caddyshack, well, we're waiting. But it made a lot of sense. I believe that he announced on the day that was to be the birthday of his late mother, if I'm not mistaken. So, that obviously has tremendous sentimental value, so that announcement date makes a whole lot of sense. So, yeah, he brings 4-star accolades. He might be maybe not a full-on project. It just doesn't sound like he's necessarily somebody that folks are anointing as like a starting candidate, for this year, but things swing around in a hurry. So you mentioned he's got a lot of time left to play. So that development, he can get under the tutelage of ASU's coaching staff and with Coach Joe in the weight room and get that part going. But again, you welcome those sort of guys back with open arms. So that's a good ad to finally make official. Yeah,
ASU, after losing 4 starters from that offensive line, now really has done a great job. I mean, this I thought was the most pressing need for the offseason to-do list and for them to go shopping in the portal, and they've done a really good job. And so, just looking at just how this reshaped offensive line might look, You have, of course, Isaiah Glass, who was the starter for most of the season last year at left tackle. He's back, but everybody else is kind of up for grabs. But Ben Coleman, one of the impact starters from Cal, coming over in the portal, he looks like a guy you could probably plug him in at left guard. I mentioned Fatanu at center. Joy Ramos, who suffered unfortunately a season-ending injury in fall camp after transferring back to ASU from his time at Iowa State. He's a guy that could get in there and factor in on the right side, perhaps at right guard. Aaron Frost, the multi-time All-Mountain West offensive tackle, also I believe has some experience at guard from Nevada. He's in that mix as well. A couple of guys that coming over from the junior college ranks as well. And then you add Bram Walden to this mix. All of a sudden, this Sun Devil offensive line goes from a big-time kind of red flag to, potentially, as you mentioned, something that could be, as good or perhaps even better than what we saw a year ago.
Yeah, I mean, there were deficiencies, to say the least, a year ago, but the reloading, retooling, restocking that ASU has done is something very impressive. I mean, at a minimum, it's kind of like we talked about last week. You got to start from the ground up in a lot of respects with this program. So the first thing is building enough depth and getting a viable starting group out there. And then you build from there. Then you build for the future. So this group is something that, again, looks good on paper. Naturally, you would imagine the vast majority, if not all of them, are going to be in here for the spring. So they're going to get the opportunity to work together so that you don't necessarily have to create a patchwork offensive line with multiple new pieces in the fall. You can get them some practices, some time together before that all comes together. So, again, there are a lot of things when it comes to just the talent acquisition in this football program right now that you got to be very happy about. And the offensive line is near, if not at the top of the list because of just how many holes there were to fill and that they're not being filled with players without starting experience, that sort of thing. Again, when you're getting guys who have multiple years of starting experience, once you've been on some measure of all conference caliber lists, I think where ASU is right now with its rebuild, that is something that you can be happy with. You might not be getting Orlando Pace at every position, but you're getting solid players with experience and who are capable of playing at this level, and to me, that's a win.
All right, so ASU, of course, is going to only add impact players from here on out, at least in their view, and in the words of Kenny Dillingham. So while it won't be necessarily as kind of fast and furious and such a whirlwind as it was over the first couple of weeks of the Dillingham era, in which I believe now the total between the high school signees that we covered last week in the portal additions, I mean, you're bringing in over 30 new players in the span of about 30 days. So it's some tireless work by this new staff, and we will, of course, see how it all plays out. But now, Joe, it is time for our 2022 Season Awards Spectacular. We're going to honor the best and the worst of the season that was. But let's start things off on a positive note. What was your best surprise of the year? Now, this, of course, can be a player, a trend, a development, just kind of generally something that was surprising in a positive way.
So, I mean, obviously this season had more, negative surprises or forgettable moments or things that, like Bobby Hurley wants to do with that San Francisco game and things you want to flush. But, one positive surprise, and it's something that has a tangible and lasting effect, is just the energy that Sean Aguano brought to this program when he was elevated to interim head coach. Obviously the wins didn't stack up, and ASU finished with, in one capacity it's worst season ever, in some capacity it's worst season in several decades. So those sort of things may not necessarily make it seem like a massive impact, but just the energy and the refreshing passion that he brought to the program during his time as interim head coach, because again, his back was heavily against the wall and trying to put something together in terms of wins and losses. But that energy was something that just created a little bit of comfort and spark, among the fan base, a little bit of rejuvenation for the future. And it's something that obviously is carried over, as we of course know. He is still part of this coaching staff. And I think that was just kind of a segue to the energy that you have with this staff with Kenny Dillingham. So, that was something that, again, was just kind of refreshing and rejuvenating to see a guy that was going to go out there and do things the right way with a ton of energy, even when things are going poorly, even when there are more losses than victories, even when you really can't figure out a way to reverse course and make the season much better than it started. So for me, that was a positive surprise. Just that in the midst of so much chaos, coaching change, NCAA investigation, a lot of losses, you still had that sort of energy going on.
Yeah, my award is on a similar note. Just the surprising nature that this is a team that no matter how tough things got, how ugly the situation was, and how perhaps understandable it might have been for them to maybe perhaps late in a blowout game or in some tough spots, or at least just kind of given the way the season had unfolded, that this is a team that fought to the bitter end each and every game, every play, gave it their all. They, even though they ended the season, of course, on that unfortunate losing streak, they went down swinging each and every time. Games going like on the road at Washington State in frigid temperatures, where it was just and of course falling down big in that first half. But this is a team that just would scratch and claw and fight back, and no matter what the situation was, they showed the grit and the resolve. And I think that's a big testament to what Sean Aguano was able to accomplish in terms of just getting this team to continue to buy in, play for them, play for each other, and it was just good to see. And while the wins weren't necessarily there, it's just something we saw. You go back to like even 2016, just kind of the way some of those players handled the struggles near the end of that season, and how the way the kind of that disappointing campaign came to a conclusion. This really jumped out to me in stark contrast, that this was a team that was going to give it their all no matter what. And I think that even though this moral victories aren't what you go for, but you just have to kind of even though the deck was perhaps stacked against the players in some ways this past season, that you got to tip their cap to them for playing hard each and every down. So now on the flip side of that, Joe, what was the worst surprise that you saw from this past season?
So, there were quite a few, but I'd say for me, it was just how poorly as a whole the defense played. And you can break that down into, different categories. But, with Coach Rodriguez, when he was obviously still here, you had high hopes that the defensive line would get the absolute most out of it and surprise you. They certainly didn't do that. Run defense was atrocious. Couldn't get to the quarterback for much anything. You had a lot of experienced players who, some played well individually, but it just didn't come together. I remember at the start of the season, you look at the lineup and say, what? They've got some good transfers in, got some returning players. You have faith in the coaching staff to get the most out of the guys up front. Like, this could be a pretty decent defense. Maybe not just the bunch of killers, but something that's solid. And it was just so bad. I mean, to the point that if you have even not a slightly less terrible defense, then you probably win the Territorial Cup game, maybe some others. We saw some sparks. Like, of course, that Stanford game was such a weird anomaly in what it was. But like I said, as a whole, expected the defense to be able to be so much better than it was. It was real disheartening and real frustrating to see that for the majority of the season.
So mine's kind of more specifically targeting my ire at the run defense. I mean, just absolutely ugly numbers. And kind of to piggyback off of what Joe was talking about, before the season, I thought this defense was going to do really well because they did have a lot of key returners. There was a lot of experience on this side of the ball. And then you supplement that with guys like coming in that were like Nesta Jade Silvera, the defensive tackle from Miami. Yet, of course, the extensive experience in the backfield or in the secondary. And then, of course, you have a linebacker group led by Merlin Robertson and Kyle Soley. And I thought that Connor Soley was poised for a big breakout. But then just overall, the scheme was just so vanilla. And we've talked about it at length and very passive and just was not suitable for success. And I thought the players were, in fact, let down by the defensive coaching overall in the schematically. So you look at last year, this is a run defense that held opponents to under 4 yards a carry, 3.6 to be precise. And granted, yards per game is kind of a flawed metric, but still 131 yards per game on the ground. This year, ASU allowed 188 on the ground overall. That's this program's worst mark since 1988. They gave up 5.2 yards per carry. ASU's never given up a mark that bad, if the Sun Devil Online record book is to be believed. I believe the prior record was 5.0. So ASU gave up 5.2 yards per carry. Opponents scored 31 rushing touchdowns against the Sun Devils. You have just too much talent up front. Yeah, and we talked at length over the last few years about how Robert Rodriguez is a very good defensive line coach. The linebackers, Kyle Soley, of course, had put together a solid season, had a lot of tackles, but just time and time again, all those pieces could not come together cohesively and find the run fits to just do anything to provide even a below average run defense. And I agree, Joe, that even just a D plus type of run defense perhaps gets you keeps the Territorial Cup, as well as perhaps maybe steal another game or two. So that was, to me, very surprising. Someone who had pretty high expectations for this defense heading into the year. On a more superfluous note, Joe, this is one of the categories that kind of gets a lot of discussion every year. What was your uniform combination of the year?
So I was thinking it through because there really weren't ones that stood too deeply out to me. I guess because they did not have a black combination. Usually something with that is kind of the look that catches me the most, because they didn't do like a blackout type of game this year, did they?
Yeah, I mean they can't do the true blackout. They did have the blackout game, but of course it was with the gold helmets.
Yeah,
but yeah. And like the only new element, because they did carry over the gold jerseys, was those the sand uniforms, or whatever the precise term.
Which is funny because that was the most memorable game of this season. But I think we're in agreement here. Even though it was a vastly forgettable game, the look against Eastern Michigan was a pretty crisp look. I kind of cycled through. I had to in preparation of this go back and look. Because there are a lot of games were forgettable. So the uniform combinations kind of fall into that temporary football amnesia situation. But I'll give that. I think it was what it was, maroon gold, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes,
for that particular game. So again, pretty good look there.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty good. Of course, just standard gold pants, maroon jersey. But I think what Jerry Neely and his staff were able to do really well. You just take the maroon helmet, throw on the gold face mask, which I think really helps pop a little bit with the big gold fork decal affixed. So yeah, a very sharp look for an otherwise dreadful evening of Sun Devil football. All right, so on a more positive note, this was a rough season for the Sun Devil program, of course, but there were some great moments. Joe, what was the singular best moment for you this year?
I think it was just it's kind of an accumulation of moments, but the effort that Trenton Bourguet had, coming out of the bullpen, so to speak, against Washington, because that you saw some firepower, you saw a guy that's been waiting his turn and came out and completely ready for the situation and beat a ranked and very good Washington team, and outdid one of the who remains, even now into the postseason, one of the top performing statistical quarterbacks in the country. He outperformed him. So that was just a feel-good moment, a great game, a great win, and it gave you some momentum and hope that things were really going to start catching on, and that the season could be successful to an extent, because I think that entered right into the bye week. So when we did the bye week roundtable, we had a lot of energy and hope and momentum and that sort of thing. Obviously, it didn't pan out as we expected, but that afternoon, that moment, and Trent Bourguet getting able to just soak it all in and perform like he did, get some national accolades, that I think was clearly just the lightning in a bottle situation for the year that you can say is the most enjoyable, most memorable moment, if you will.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's my pick as well. Just him coming off the bench, ASU's off, going against a ranked opponent at that time. The deck was stacked a little bit, but Bourguet just coming off and I remember sitting there in the press box, just some of those plays and the throws that this is a guy that you didn't necessarily have those high expectations, and coming off the bench against the ranked teams pretty difficult, but he was just making some big time throws in that game and leading I believe he had 3 touchdowns in that contest. So, yeah, just Bourguet off the bench was a pretty good moment for the Sun Devils in an otherwise kind of forgettable season, and provided for a little bit, some nice hope getting the marquee win of the season. So, tip of the cap to Bourguet's effort in relief against Washington. On the flip side, Joe, the worst moment in a season full of them.
For me, it was just the end of that Eastern Michigan game. Now, again, they are an incredibly well-coached team, a very good team. But still, that was a game that, by all accounts, ASU should have won. The performance was lackluster, to say the least. Of course, it led to the firing of Herm Edwards, even though at the time, minus the the video that kind of leaked from him talking with Ray Anderson and Michael Crow. I just remember at the end of that game, you're like, what in the hell just happened? It was one of those ones where you figured, all right, they're going to go score, 21 points in the fourth quarter and, make it happen. It was just such the way that the game happened, everything about it was just so putrid, and that it, for folks like us, I mean, we had obviously what in retrospect and what in hindsight looked like unrealistic expectations, but at the time entering the season, I'm like, all right, this could be a 500 team, give or take, but at that time it was like, all right, maybe things are going to be as bad as some people are speculating, and they did turn out that way. So that was the catalyst to it. Obviously, the departure of Herm Edwards was and is a good thing, but it was just such a chaotic, disheartening, depressing, disappointing time. It just didn't make sense because the first couple weeks, ASU looked fine against NAU, perfectly good. I think, passing scores across the board were very competitive against what at the time was a very good Oklahoma State team. So you go into that game still feeling pretty good about things. But at the end of it, you're like, is this team going to win another game all year long? So that was very, very disheartening. Again, the team itself, the opponent itself, much better than the likes of, UNLV from 2008 or New Mexico State from, what was it, 99, but it still kind of falls in that category of, a lower conference team that ASU should not be losing to at home.
Yeah, so for me, that there's a lot of those kind of dreary moments throughout the season, but you go to the end of the U of A game where ASU's offense is getting defense, is getting run over. But as we've seen in these rivalry games, they always seem to find a way, especially in the last 5 years. You go back to 2018, being down 19 in the fourth. There always seemed to be a way that ASU could sneak back, and lo and behold, ASU, in spite of shooting themselves repeatedly in the foot with terrible defense and repeated turnovers, found a way back. And so if ASU was able to make that fourth down stand, get another chance to perhaps keep the cup in Tempe, but just the protection broke down. Bourguet got hit, and then of course as a result of the hit, the throw was off target. 5th turnover for ASU on the day. Really, just kind of was just the low point, because this is like, okay, if you can salvage the win over Arizona and keep the cup, the season's not a complete and utter disaster. Unfortunately, ASU wasn't able to do that. They, of course, fell short. The cup now resides in Tucson temporarily. But it was just that moment where it's like, okay, you always expected the bailout at some juncture, that it was going to come down the pike, but it just never. In that moment right there where you let your quarterback get hit and then yet another turnover, just kind of finally slammed that door. It was just like the final nail in the coffin of we talked about Bobby Hurley saying, just kind of flush it, bro. That was just kind of maybe the moment that you just need to flush the 2022 football season. And so, but moving on to a better note. I mean, granted, there's not a whole lot of ones from which to choose, but what was the best win of the season?
I think there's no other option that you can give other than Washington. There are only 3 to choose from, unless you go with like moral victories or the win of getting Kenny Dillingham, or if you want to get fancy like that. But if we're talking about a football game that ASU scored more points than its opponent, you beat a ranked team in Washington, no brainer.
Yeah, so that doesn't need any further explanation. We can move on. Now, a category with much further competition. Worst loss of the year.
So, I mean, you look at it, obviously ASU played a real tough schedule. When you look back at things, I think that's something that, again, don't really see the forest for the trees. Nobody really wants to relive recollect much of the season. But ASU obviously played a difficult schedule when you had teams that were as good as they were. And again, I'm going to refer to one that I just mentioned a moment ago. Although it was against a very good and very extremely well-coached team, I'm still going to say Eastern Michigan is the worst loss just because of the fact of how it shook everything up. And more importantly, worst loss in this context to me doesn't necessarily need to be the poorest team to which ASU lost. It can also, of course, include in what game did ASU perform the poorest. And I think that there's probably no debate that the worst performance ASU had on the field was that game against Eastern Michigan. So when you package it all together, again, a team that you shouldn't be losing to, even though they were good, and the performance, more significantly, the performance or lack thereof by ASU, and everything, all that unraveled as a result of the defeat, that Eastern Michigan game is the one that takes it for me.
Obviously that's a great pick. I'm not choosing that because Eastern Michigan's a really good team. I believe they finished with 9 wins. There might be some overlook factor there at all, but for me, it was just the most inexplicable, perhaps, was Stanford because, as you mentioned, ASU comes over and beats Washington at home. They beat a ranked team. They go into the bye with a lot of positive momentum. And, of course, at that point, the conversation really centered around whether Trenton Bourget should be the starter because, of course, Emory Jones was knocked out due to a concussion, and the whole debate whether you lose your job due to injury and so on and so forth. But in any event, ASU had a lot of positive momentum probably for the first time all season long, coming off after those 3 straight losses. Or those 3 straight losses, and then before the win over Washington. And then you get a bye week to kind of recalibrate, refocus, get some momentum. And at that point, Sean Aguano has been in seat as the interim for a little bit. But then you go off against a horrific Stanford team, against literally almost no fans in the stands. You don't score for it was the last 46 minutes of that game. And you let them chip away. ASU's defense does not allow a touchdown to Stanford, but you lose 15-14. And it was just a dreadful showing against a horrific conference opponent. And who knows if all of a sudden that game, if they can win that game, if perhaps the course of the season goes on a better way, or if they had made the quarterback change, or if Sean Aguano had taken the play-calling reins from Glenn Thomas a little bit sooner. You can what-if yourself to death there, but you just could not, under any circumstance, excuse a loss to the 2020 version of the Stanford Cardinal. That's a terrible, terrible team, and that was a terrible, terrible loss in a season pretty full of them. So that's my pick, ASU's loss to Stanford. All right. Now, this was a season where a lot of the coaching staff came under fire. And this for the play, just because of what we saw on the field and perhaps lack of development. Now, for Assistant Coach of the Year, I think we need to make a special designation. Obviously, Sean Aguano opened the year as the running backs coach, a position he had for, of course, the few years prior. But nine games as the interim head coach, we'll put him in his own separate category for the purposes of this award. But, Joe, some coaches did elevate their position groups. Who do you think did the best job last year?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of process of elimination. If we're taking Aguano out of the mix, which, of course is fair because he was the head coach for the majority of the season, you really can't be too happy with either coordinator. The defense did what it did. So, you kind of whittle it down to a few options, but I think we're in agreement here. But as you do that and as you look back and think of things, Bobby Wade coaching the wide receivers is something that you can take positives away from. You look at how Elijah Badger became the guy that he was, praised to be when he was recruited here, because you weren't really certain because he had the issues that kept him off the field. That first season, the COVID season, he was used a little bit in 2021. So you're hoping that it would come together, and it absolutely did. You had Gio Sanders turn into a legitimate playmaker at this level. Brian Thompson, had a very satisfactory season in his last year, at the college level after his first campaign in ASU. It wasn't quite what you expected. So, all things considered, entering the season largely due to the transfer portal departures of the likes of Ricky Pearsall and LV Bunkley Shelton, Johnny Wilson, and others, you were thinking that the wide receiver group was going to be a major, major concern all year long. And as things shifted out, it was a position group of relative strength, and you got to give Wade a lot of credit toward that.
Yeah, he's the pick. He's the consensus choice for our assistant coach of the year. Because you did have a lot of questions about this wide receiver group. 5 scholarship receivers had left the program in the last portal cycle, and a lot of question marks as to how this passing game would transform. Now, granted, the first half of the season kind of fits and starts and some struggles with Glenn Thomas kind of calling plays out there and perhaps not necessarily playing to his players' strengths, but the wide receivers were able to kind of step up in big moments. And for me, and we'll talk about this guy more in a minute, Gio Sanders just kind of going from a guy that was looked at to perhaps maybe being the number 2 guy out of the slot to being the next Gary Chambers, a guy who caught a lot of balls and every one seemed to mean something. He would move the chains, find the end zone, come in a key moment. And then, of course, the emergence of Elijah Badger is one of the top up-and-coming receivers in the entire conference as well. So I think Bobby Wade did a great job in leading that wide receiver room. It sounds like he might be sticking around in some capacity. We'll find out what his future might hold. But this is one of the few categories that we put out there to our listeners in a Twitter poll. Hopefully you voted, and if you didn't, make sure you're following us at SOTD Podcast. The listeners also chose Bobby Wade as their pick for the assistant coach of the year with 51% of the vote. Tight end coach Justin Wood, and of course the group led by Jalen Conyers, his emergence down the back half of the season. Wood picked up 28% of the vote, and Aaron Fletcher, the DB's coach, got 17%. But hats off to Bobby Wade for during a difficult season to elevate a position group that all of a sudden, just kind of the tenor of the feel of this group heading into last season. Whole lot of question marks, but I think heading into this 2023 campaign, you're going to find this is a team strength and a group that a lot of fans are already very excited about. So let's knock off the final, perhaps negative category of the awards show. This is always kind of a tough one every year because these guys, of course, put in so much work and effort to all year long to get ready for this season. But Joe, who is your most disappointing player of 2022?
So I think with this, it's important to define the word disappointing because, disappointing can mean a lot of different things. It can mean someone that just has a bad season. It could be someone that just does not live up to expectations, even if that person has a relatively decent season. It can also be someone who just is not put in a position to succeed. Disappointing just basically means that there were expectations at one point early in the year, and the outcome, the output, the results did not meet those expectations. And obviously, of course, there are a variety of factors that go into point A to point B. So the reason I kind of give that explanation is, so my answer is Emory Jones. Because I personally had high expectations for him. I figured, of course, that he'd be the starter all season long. I figured that he was going to throw for a good amount of yards, run for a ton of yards, basically be no worse and probably even better than what Jaden Daniels was at Arizona State in 2021. I was just really happy and impressed with basically the body of work that he did in the SEC, and figured if he could do that there, you come over to ASU, play in the Pac-12, you should be able to do, some good things. So with him, it was a combination, but largely, as we know, there were challenges that he faced. There were inefficiencies and ineffectiveness that he was responsible for. But the offensive game planning and execution and just how the offense was run, by Glenn Thomas prior to the point that Sean Aguano took over and really took the reins of the offense, a little bit after mid-season, was a massive factor. So again, you package it all together, the coaching, the execution, everything that goes into it. This is the guy that I thought was going to be QB1 all year long and ended up starting about half the season and leaves ASU to Cincinnati. So again, looking back at the start of the season and someone that I thought was going to be something special here and just did not have a special season, to say the least. That's why Jones takes the cake for me.
My pick is going to be switching over to the defensive side of the ball, and the secondary had some question marks. There was a lot of young talent among those Sun Devil DBs, and with a new position coach, this is one of the team's strengths that in recent years on the back end. And I thought that with Chase Lucas and Jack Jones off playing in the NFL, that Tamarcus Davis, a guy who had been around the program for a number of years and was pressed into some spot starts over his career and performed really well. And so he was looked at as kind of like, well, there were a lot of exciting young players in that secondary that were going to get a chance to shine and step up, that Tamarcus was going to be the cornerback one and be that foundational piece. But he was bad. Now, he, of course, got injured during camp, and that kind of limited him. So perhaps that was just something that kind of persisted throughout the year. But even when he did get in action, it was just a real rough watch. Ro Torrance and Ed Woods kind of emerge as the Sun Devil starting quarterbacks and some foundational pieces that are going to be exciting for 2023. But Davis just continually got burned and also just in big situations. The big pass play against Oklahoma State, he just fell down and just lost his man. Who knows if he's in coverage and does makes that play, how that game turns out. But the expectations I had as one of the veteran leaders and just kind of the drop off of play, because when we saw him in action for a number of seasons, he was a good cornerback, and then he was going to have a greater opportunity to step up and be that starter, and it just never came together for him. So it's kind of a unfortunate way for his collegiate career to kind of come to a conclusion, but it's why you have that depth. And thankfully for the Sun Devils, it was some of those younger guys were able to kind of step up and kind of offset that loss. But it just kind of disappointed to see Tamarcus and his Sun Devil career end in such a fashion. All right, so now just positivity the rest of the way out, starting with Breakout Player of the Year. Now, this is going to be a guy that had been in the program and kind of made a big leap forward. And I think this is one of the categories, Joe, where you and I differ. So who is your pick?
So this was one that put some research into there, because there were a few legitimate candidates. I kind of wanted to look at the numbers, and this is a guy that, man, I'd have to do a lot of digging, but it might be hard pressed to find players in the conference, maybe even the country, that had such a difference in production from the first half of the season to the second half of the season. Obviously, the denominator there was the fact of when Sean Aguano took greater reign, greater control of the offense. It's Jalen Conyers. Over the final 5 games of the season, he had 30 catches for 346 yards, 5 touchdowns. Just to put that in, I mean, you hear that, that's good. 6 catches a game on average. That's good. About almost 70 yards and a touchdown a game. That's good. But just to think about how good it really is. So the last time that an ASU tight end had a 5-game stretch of any time in the season, but it's going to be within a season, so we're not saying like the last couple games of one year and rolling it over to the next. The last time an ASU tight end had more yards in any 5-game stretch was Todd Heap in 1999. Pretty good tight end. The last time an ASU tight end had 30 catches over a 5-game stretch, Zach Miller in 2004. Again, pretty good tight end. In fact, those two, I think no one's ever going to debate, are the 2 best tight ends in school history. Now, Zach Miller had exactly 30 catches, the same amount as Jalen Conyers had. Peeling back the onion even more. So Todd Heap never had, 30 across a 5-game stretch. There are only 4 seasons prior to those two guys where an ASU tight end even had 30 receptions in a year, ranging from 31 to 49, and the most recent of those 4 was 1983, so not a lot of information is available. Long story short, The 30 catches tie for the most in a 5-game stretch for an ASU tight end in at least 40 years and could even be the most in school history for all I know. So what am I saying here is this guy went from a lightly used player that's, people are rightfully griping about the tight ends not being used, wondering if he's just going to be kind of a reserve, even though he's a 4-star recruit coming out of high school, began his career at Oklahoma. And then you fast forward into October, November, and move forward toward the 2023 season and beyond, and this guy has, high caliber all-conference or better potential. This guy's looking like a bona fide NFL star with what he's doing, not just by catching the ball, but moving around after the catch and getting big yardage plays, just becoming an absolute superstar in the making, and you feel like that's only going to climb higher because of how Kenny Dillingham and staff like to use the tight ends. Obviously, that's focusing on the future, not a review of this past season. But, when kind of like reverse engineering things and saying, in the previous category, the disappointment was talking about, okay, what's a player that you had bona fide high expectations for in the beginning of the season that didn't pan out? Who's a guy that, maybe the end result was way higher than you thought? The way things ended for Jalen Conyers, I don't think any of us would have seen that coming, much less the projections that are ahead of him. So though there are other very qualified candidates, he took himself into a different universe and is going to be discussed among some of the better tight ends in the country as we enter the 2023 season. I don't think anyone would have seen that coming in August and early September.
Our listeners agreed with you, Joe. Jalen Conyers was their pick. 51% of the vote. Beating out, I think this might be our closest category in terms of the listener vote, beating out wide receiver Elijah Badger, 43%. My pick is going in a little bit different direction because now obviously if you're looking just in terms of like total production and just kind of momentum, Conyers and Badger I think are head and shoulders above the rest. But for me personally, both of those guys had high expectations and kind of delivered to varying degrees on those expectations. We know that Badger was an exciting playmaker, took some time to get ramped up, and then when he was finally, made the wide receiver one, he performed. And once Sean Aguano took the play calling away from Glenn Thomas and decided to use the very talented tight ends that he had, the production followed. But for me, Giovanni Sanders just kind of came out of nowhere. I remember talking about Cam Johnson, a guy who had a 50 reception season in SEC play, coming over here from Vandy, and he's a guy that really kind of projected immediately to the slot. And then seeing those guys in fall camp, and Gio Sanders just kept making plays, and more reps, kept running with the ones and all. And like, where's Cam? This is going to be just need time to get his feet wet. But Gio took that job as the starting slot and never gave it up. I mean, he was really good, and we talked about him just being a guy that just made big catch after big catch. On the year, he was second on the team with 40 catches for 500 yards on the dot and a big touchdown in the Territorial Cup game. And then for 27 of his 40 were for first downs. They moved the chains. This is a guy, again, the new Gary Chambers, a guy who just when he makes a catch, it's going to mean something. It's going to help your team win. And so just kind of given the relative expectations of like this guy is going to be the number 2 slot to second, making that jump up to second leading receiver, and a guy who makes tough catches in tough spots. That for me is why I'm picking him as the breakout player of the year with, of course, the great Jalen Conyers. Now, the next category, Joe, a little bit. This is devoted specifically for newcomers to the roster in 2022. There were some good ones, but it seemed like one guy was just really good and head and shoulders above the rest.
Yeah, I mean, he was the ex-Valade, the most consistent player the entire season long. Highway robbery, he wasn't named first team all conference, at least by the coaches, but other
the AP got it right.
There you go, as they tend to do. Again, some others that deserve mention, Nesta Jade Silvera, Ro Torrance, and others, but no one stacks up to what he did. Just massively productive, not just at ASU. Obviously, his college career was something incredibly special with what he did at Wyoming, but as good as some of the others were, he's performed better than just about anybody on either side of the ball for ASU all year long. So that's an easy pick.
Yeah, I mean, a guy who scores 18 touchdowns is going to be a pretty significant piece of your team. And so, yeah, he was coming in. Obviously, a guy that had a great success at Wyoming, but perhaps there were some questions as to how beaten up some Mountain West defenses will compare now that you're going up against the Pac-12, and he put together his best season overall. But just some other guys that you mentioned. Nesta Jade Silvera comes in here. 56 tackles for a defensive tackle, pretty good. 4.5 for loss, and of course had knocked down a few passes. Didn't perhaps have the number of plays behind the line of scrimmage that he was looking for, but it was really just a good active force on that defensive front in that middle. Probably the funniest moment of the year when he did the little squirt attack at Caleb Williams. I think if there was an award here for best and most personable interview of the year. I mean, every time Nesta talked to the media, it was always a treat there. He came away with 15% of the vote, but the listeners, of course, in a runaway. X Valade was the choice there. All right, Joe. So now that we have a coaching staff that seems to be putting a proper focus on the Arizona-born talent, in the second year that we've done this, after DJ Davidson took home the crown for Homegrown Player of the Year 2021. Who's your pick for 2022?
So there are a couple ways you could go with it, because there were some productive players that are from the state of Arizona. But when I think of someone that's homegrown, someone that was tremendously productive at the high school level, someone that's been in this program for a while, like it just. I think homegrown. I think someone that came up through the ranks here, began his career as a walk-on, prepared like he was going to get in the game every chance he had, so he was always ready, whether it was when he was a true freshman or fast forward to this season. The preparation was always there. Someone, he and his entire family love Arizona State. So Trenton Bourguet is my answer. Again, there are others that you could have in there, and they're very deserving of it. But when I think of just someone that is really all about Arizona State, who has just earned his stripes and paid his dues and deserves every bit of the success he had last year and whatever's to come from his future, that's something that really catches my attention, for this award.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. He was the listener pick at 56% of the vote. My pick captured 41%, and that's Kyle Soley. A guy that, again, came into the program. He's been here for a number of years, and just a guy that you thought might be a good rotational piece eventually once he kind of bulks up of the linebacker group. But year after year, he just kind of exceeded expectations. All of a sudden, he became a starter. Then he became a team captain, and just became one of the absolute best linebackers in the conference a season ago. And unfortunately, the sum of the defense wasn't necessarily there along with him, but he just put together one of the more productive defensive seasons that we've seen in a while. And being a homegrown guy, former Scottsdale Saguaro SaberCat, getting to start alongside his brother Connor in this defense. This is a guy who, it meant something to wear that maroon and gold. A guy who grew up watching games in the stands as a kid, and to be in this program for 5 years, and to kind of put together, do what he did, and unfortunately kind of left on a sour note with losing the last game, and kind of overall in this very difficult season. But it's hard to find some guys that really care more about this program than Kyle Soley and Trenton Bourguet. So some good picks for the homegrown player there. Now you might hear that same name. I think we're going to keep it going, Joe. Defensive Player of the Year.
Yeah, no other name you can throw out there other than Kyle Soley. I mean, man, just massively, massively productive. Just a beast. Especially in kind of the first half or first stretch of the season. I mean, the numbers were astronomical in terms of tackles and things like that. Just brought energy and leadership and passion, things that, he's one of those players that you want on your roster every single season. So shame to see him go work his way out of the program, and hope all the best for, his future, hopefully at the professional level. But, he would have been it was a tough call at the previous category between Trenton Bourguet and Kyle Soley, but this one, no-brainer.
Yeah, Kyle Soley is taking that home, and he's the first guy since Christian Sam in 2017 to top 100 tackles. He Solely finished with 110 on the year, 3 for loss, couple of interceptions as well. And you mentioned just like he was a tackle machine early on. 5 tackles in the opener, didn't have to play him too much in that win over NAU, but then went on 6 straight games with double-digit tackles. Maxing out with 18 against Eastern Michigan. I believe at that time he was the number 2 in tackles per game in the country. Got banged up a little bit down the stretch. Did not play against Washington State. But just a guy that really was just an indispensable part of a defense, and what success they were able to have usually was kind of centered around Kyle Soley kind of in that mix as well. Nesta Jade Silvera captured 20% of the vote. Ro Torrance, I thought, put together a really good season, and perhaps if he played a little bit more at that same level of play, but he missed a few games throughout the course of the year. But Kyle Soley, the clear pick, 74% of our listener vote there. So just not perhaps in a team sense the way he wanted to go out, but individually, he left it all out there on the field, filled up the stat sheet, and this is a guy that should be playing and having some work on Sundays for years to come. Last couple categories, Joe, I think are also probably going to be a little anticlimactic. Offensive Player of the Year.
I mean, you got to go X, obviously. Really no suspense there, debate there. Others, Elijah Badger, had a very, very good season and should propel him into, even better days ahead. Jalen Conyers, Trent Bourget, they had, chunks of games that were really impressive, but I mean, there's no comparison. You don't even really have to describe it too much to validate it for a valid day. Because X just had a phenomenal season, and again, even though the year as a whole for ASU was, very forgettable, and I think we had generally high expectations of him. I don't think anybody expected him to do what he did. He was the brightest spot on the entire team, and that was consistently just about all year long. It wasn't someone that necessarily had just a big chunk of games that made the numbers look better than they were for the season or something like that. It was pretty much week in, week out. He was doing his thing.
Yeah, X is the clear choice there. And, I mean, his ability to just be to shoulder that load. And you just, it's kind of, you felt that at times kind of Rashad White 2021-ish, of just like the passing game was scuffling along. You just knew that ASU had run, X and that's about it, but he was still able to get that done. Started the year with 3 100-yard games in a row. He had 4 more over the course of the season. Damn near had another one against U of A. He had 97 yards there, but also 2 touchdowns, 18 total scores on the year. Of course, guys like Elijah Badger, 70 catches for 866 yards, 7 touchdowns, really good. But it's clear that X was the Offensive Player of the Year, and I think this is going to complete the hat trick here, Joe. Who's your pick for Team MVP in 2022?
Once again, you got to give it to X. In a season where the bright spots were not as abundant as you'd have liked, his was the brightest. He just embodied that mentality, like you were talking about, how the team, didn't quit even in defeat. He just played hard every single week, and the numbers were there. Very, very impressive season. Huge acquisition for ASU. Again, even though the season as a whole and the win-loss record was real bad, his performance all year long, something very, very good. And, you're very confident that he's got a lot of football left ahead of him. So for the season long that was forgettable as it was, his 1 year as a Sun Devil will live on for a very long time in fond memories for ASU fans.
Yeah, he was the clear pick with our listeners, 77% over Badgers, 19%. But beyond the on-field production, it was X. I think X brought something very special to the sidelines, to the locker room, just into the weight room. He was really one of the team's key leaders and the key voices. During a very difficult season, you talk to some of the guys on that team, and just it was X that sometimes when whether it was the offense or even the defense was scuffling along, he would come over with some supportive words and get the guys fired up and ready to go. And just you could not find a negative word said about ex-Valladay amongst any of his teammates. And when you have that kind of respect and that level of the veteran leadership, along with a guy rushing for over 1,100 yards and scoring 18 times, that makes for a pretty special season from a very special player. And he's the clear choice to cap off our award show as the 2022 season MVP. And that's going to do it for this episode of Speak of the Devils. Make sure you stay with us on the social media side of things, of course. The portal is still open, so there's some potential for some new notable additions in the coming days and weeks ahead. You can follow the show on Twitter at SOTD Podcast, on Instagram at Speak of the Devils, Facebook.com/SOTD Podcast, and follow me on Twitter and Instagram at BDenny29.
And you can follow me on everything at Joe Healy42. And as always, huge thank you. Shout out to our sponsors. Go spend your hard-earned money at every single one of them. And, of course, that list includes DeFalco's Deli, Cactus Sports, DevilsDigest.com, Jones Auto Group, Spaghetti Shack, and Sun Devil Family Charities. Promise you, you're going to get the longer, wordier explanations of why we love them so much on the next show. But for now, give them all your love and whatever money you can, because as you know, they're great for the Sun Devil community to support every single one of our wonderful sponsors.
Yeah, they are going to be helping to activate the Valley, so give them your money. Give us your 5-star review on the podcast platform of your choice. And Joe and I will be back next week talking something that is very interesting, no doubt.